confidence in crises. So I need to get one of those giant monitors and stop doing everything on my little laptop. But confidence in crises, as Mitch said, covers the period from 1920 to 1948. So our kind of bookend dates are the 19th Amendment, which won't surprise anybody. And then in 1948, it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that sort of bookends this unit in WAMS. Reminder, you can find all this stuff on the internet at wams.nyhistory.org. And actually, maybe I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to give you a brief tour of the site. As I said, it's going to change a little bit when we launch the new units in December. Early December, but the navigation will remain the same. So here's the homepage, wams.nyhistory.org, which this is the thing that's going to change the most, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on it, but you can hover over the curriculum on the top navigation here, and that shows you the full 10 units, and the units is really where the stuff is. All the stuff of WAMS is in the units. So then you can click on one. So we're about to do confidence in crises, so I preloaded it. So it'll take you to the home page for that unit, where you'll see sort of how it's all laid out. So in each of the 10 units, we provide you key ideas, a brief introductory essay to just sort of situate us in US history and what was happening for women generally at this time. It's obviously very broad strokes. It's quite brief. Then those unit essential questions. And then each unit, as I said, is divided into subsections. So confidence in crises, we divided basically chronologically, again, to sort of track with what we see in US history textbooks. So the Jazz Age, the Great Depression, World War II, and then post-war. And then here you see where you can explore by theme, and you can click on one of these and it'll populate sort of a search for you. But so you would click into one of the sections. So I went ahead and clicked on the Jazz Age. Oops. And in the sections is where you find the actual resources. So again, for each section, we have sub key ideas for this particular era, another brief intro essay. All of these are links to the different resources. So the intro essays and the sections sort of illuminate how we are weaving together the sources that we've decided to include in here, section essential questions, and then the resources themselves. So you can see that there's a variety of types of sources, images, documents. Here's a great one to your question, Sarah, housework and social science, and sort of the birth of the home economics movement. And also you should look at Ellen Swallow Richards' life story, who's in here as well. Documents, etc., and then the life stories. So when you click into a document, for example, here is the Equal Rights Amendment, which we don't have time to look at today, but what you see on the resource pages is, in this case, as I said, an image of the document itself, then we've transcribed it and given the summary next to it. And then here's where you as the teacher, if you are in a physical classroom and printing things, you can just print the original text, or you can print the side-by-side text and summary. Here's another source that goes along with it. And then you scroll down, and then for each resource, we write brief background information, so sort of historical context, and then about the document is sort of specific things about this resource that students might need to help them understand and analyze it. Vocabulary words, discussion questions, and then suggested activities. So as I said, we don't do scripted lessons, but instead do just sort of these ideas for activities folks can do in the classroom. And then there are like a million ways to print a given page of WAMS, so you can print different sections. And then the life stories, so here's, oops, this is something that's getting fixed when we relaunch the website. We don't have time today to talk about Anna May Wong, but she's included here. So we always include one or two images of the person, and then we write out this short biography of her life. Again, vocabulary, discussion questions, and suggested activities. So that gives you sort of a high-level look at how the site is organized, how it works, how you can find the various things. Oh, and then I didn't show you, but there is a search feature it's a keyword search with all kinds of filters to help you find specific sources. If, you know, you're like, oh God, tomorrow I have to teach about the Great Depression. What am I going to, New Deal, what am I going to teach about? You just go in, you type New Deal, and it'll show you what is on WAMs relevant to that. Okay, so as I said, these are the sections in Confidence in Crises. We're going to spend most of our time together in the Jazz Age, and then we'll dip into the Great Depression, and then just do a real quick speed through World War II so you get a sense for some of the resources that are in there. So our essential questions for this section, again, pulled from the WAM site. To what extent did women experience dramatic shifts in their roles as women and citizens in this era? And how did the Great Depression and World War II disrupt or maintain the rush towards modernity seen in the 1920s? So those are the big questions we're going to keep in mind as we go through this next bit. So we are going to start here. So as I said, of course, this unit starts in 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Which the unit that precedes this in WAMs, Modernizing America, has a whole section on the march towards suffrage, so do check that out. But we start here in 1920, and we're going to take a look at these two images to see what that moment meant in some ways for some women. So let's take a look at these two sources together, these images. And we are going to do another sort of observation, interpretation, inference. So let's start with the piece on the left. What do you see? What are some observations? What are some details that you notice in this image? Go ahead and put in the chat, what do you see? What are some details that you notice in this image on the left? Ballot box, excellent, very clearly labeled for us. Ballot box, good. Thank you, Leanna. What else? Woman has her child. And there's, okay, so it's a group of three women, three generations, the past and the future. Wonderful. Yeah, the big woman, for lack of a better word, sort of an allegory. She's allegorical, so maybe a Lady Liberty. Good, excellent. So we're sort of melding our observations and our interpretations, and I like that. But let's articulate those, right? So we're observing, we see this little girl, we see a child, we interpret that as a representation for the future, a better future for this girl. This big woman looks, you know, her robes are very reminiscent of Lady Liberty, so perhaps she's representing the United States, liberty as embodied by a woman. Good. Okay, we see the League of Women Voters. Yes, they are a sponsor of today's session. Yes, so this is a poster from the League of Women Voters. And let's see back. Anything else? Anything else that we notice in this image? Okay, Lady Liberty is pointing to the Capitol. Good, excellent. So we have this image of a woman exercising her civic duty, the allegorical Lady Liberty pointing at the US Capitol, inferring the amount of power that this vote has in the highest offices in the land, that now that women have secured this right to vote, it's something that will not be taken away as represented by the daughter. Women have a voice in political issues. Excellent. Wonderful. And so then let's turn our attention to our second image here, the one on the right. Okay, so we say picture on the left is peaceful. The right is angst energy. Yeah, good. What are some details that we notice? What are some things we might circle if we had this printed out in front of us as important? Excellent. The Alamo. What does the Alamo represent? What does the inclusion of the Alamo tell us? Toxic masculinity. Yeah, I like that, Mark. Some people think it's patriotic. Yeah, so the Alamo is the symbol for Texas independence, which is fight for independence is a patriotic idea for Texans, specifically white Texans at this time. And then yeah, we've got people noticing the eyes. They look a little angry. I would agree with that, sort of that furrowed brow that we see here. Some people are noticing maybe these are women's eyes because of the eyelashes. That could very well be women. The eyes of Texas are upon you. Have you paid that poll tax? What is a poll tax? First of all, let's start there. What's a poll tax? Who can tell us in the chat? Right, sacrifice life for the right cause. Ooh, I like that. Yeah, in terms of what the Alamo represents. Good. Taxpayers paid to vote. Payment to vote, says Kurt. I'm gonna move my thing over. Mitch says, did Black women get the right to vote at the same time as white women? Yeah. So poll taxes were a vow to mute himself, or if Devin mute him. Thank you. Sorry, yes. So poll taxes, as many of us know, of course, were a strategy to keep Black people from voting. So the idea that you had to pay a tax that would allow you to vote, and that was an economic barrier that many Black Americans could not overcome because of the economic inequalities baked into the Jim Crow South. So it's a nod to the fact that women getting the right to vote in Texas, and in fact across a large swath of the country. Oh, I'm like writing on my screen. I don't know how I'm doing that. That women in the country, Black women in the country, women of color, did not gain access to the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. The other thing that these posters, and also notice, the Texas League of Women Voters put out this poster on the right-hand side. So both of these are from the League of Women Voters, local chapters. So taken together, what do these two posters potentially start to tell us about women and the vote in the early 1920s? What story might they tell? Forcing women to realize that they may not have finances to vote. Voting isn't free. Okay, good. So again, so in a real way, in the 1920s, women, a lot of women, especially, well, a lot of women generally, and white women very often are dependent on their husbands for income and access to money. And so that's a factor here. Responsibility comes with the privilege, says Heather. Yeah, absolutely. So the vote that you cast will have an impact in US Congress. That's a big responsibility. We need to take it seriously. Yes, Stan and Anthony opposing the 15th Amendment because it did not include women's suffrage. Terry's noticing or mentioning that motivations were not universal. Yeah, and in fact, in the suffrage movement, and then after the passage of the 19th Amendment, a number of women's suffrage groups, one of the arguments that they made for women's suffrage was that the white woman's vote would further sort of counterbalance the Black vote, knowing that Black people had been very effectively disenfranchised, but some still did have access to the vote. Having white women who would have more or less unfettered access to the vote by virtue of their race would vote in large numbers and further dilute the influence that the Black vote may have had. So, you know, after the passage of the 19th Amendment, in the election in 1920, which was just a few months later, only 1/3 of eligible women voted on that election day. And so former suffragists were disappointed, and they mobilized and founded organizations to educate women on their right to vote, about what that meant, how to do it, and to encourage them to exercise it. So the League of Women Voters already existed, but it had a different name. It was a suffrage organization that was called the American Women's Suffrage Association, and then changed over to the League of Women Voters, which is a nonpartisan group, still exists, as we know. But each local chapter sort of had its own flavor, and in that way, you know, woman women voting, and in certain cases, chapters of the League of Women Voters, perpetuated problems that already existed, reinforced existing racial hierarchies and oppressions through this new phase of activism. And we see that division arose quickly among women activists, just like in the pre-suffrage era, as Mitch alluded to. Kurt, have you paid that poll tax? Interesting way of encouraging voting. It's true. All right, so with this in mind, that's sort of a precursor. Excuse me. We're going to dig in to the Jazz Age a little bit and take a look at what life looks like for some women in the first decade after the passage of the 19th Amendment. And Mitch, great point, reminds us that we can't talk of monolithic women's rights. Race and class always make it complicated. Something that we like to say about WAMs is women's history is American history, but also there's no such thing as a monolithic women's history. Women are diverse, have diverse experiences and identities that influence, as I sort of said earlier, how they experience the world. And there is no sort of quintessential American woman who embodies American womanhood for all women, despite the fact that there have always sort of been ideals that women are supposed to aspire to. Okay, so with that in mind, let's take a look at a couple of sources from the Jazz Age. And of course, the quintessential 1920s woman that will often jump to mind for our students are flappers, because, you know, they're fun. And they have sort of an outsized presence, perhaps, in popular culture. But we are going to look at a couple of images, and as we do, I want us to think about these questions. What's happening in this image? And it says your image. So the next slide has 3 images on it. I'm going to have you pick one. I don't know, choose a number 1 through 3. So in your head, pick number 1 through 3. So then when we go to the next slide, you're going to zoom in on that one image and think about what's happening in this image. How does it represent a shift in women's activities, in their dress and behavior, clothing, etc., in the 1920s? Note that these images are supposed to be funny. They were intended to be humorous. How can we see evidence of that? In looking at the images themselves. And then what does the humor factor tell us about the challenges women faced in embracing a more modern lifestyle? So with the passage of the 19th Amendment, it's a dawn of a new era of independence and empowerment for American women. We're also moving into the modern age in a really meaningful way. How is this playing out for young women in the 1920s? So think in your head, number 1 through 3, and then you're going to look at it and think about what's happening. How does it represent a shift? Is it funny? What does that tell us? Okay, so here are our images. Let's take a minute, just silently, look closely at your image. Think about those observations and interpretations. What details are you noticing? What does this tell us about this young woman and women more generally? What's happening? How does this represent a change? Where do we see humor? So let's just silently look. All right, so if you looked at this first image, what we'll call image 1, the red one, what is going on here? What do we see? What's going on? What does it tell us about changes in women's behavior in the 1920s? First image, go ahead and put in the chat. What do we think is happening here? Excellent. Heather, women defying convention with leg showing. Smoking. Excellent.
The skirt they wearing, they're showing more of their legs.
Yeah, man, that's a real short skirt, right? Especially relative to, if I can make this do it, this version, right? That's a much shorter skirt. We're seeing her knees, my stars. We've got a short skirt, we've got smoking. Sarah says mothers are worried. Women are graduating from college. Yes, excellent. This is the commencement issue, right? More revealing of her body, her dress generally. Sexuality, right? She's talking to a young man. They're unchaperoned. They seem to be by themselves. If you can see it at the bottom, The man is saying to her, now what shall we commence? So a little innuendo there. The ukulele, perhaps a reference to Hawaii as a territory. Excellent. All right, so we've got maybe it's the woman talking, Heather. Maybe the woman is saying, now what shall we commence? Could be. Even further pushing the envelope there. I like it.
Their involvement in arts and culture, music, arts, culture.
Excellent. Yes. We notice the date too. It's 1927. We've got Life magazine. All right. Excellent. So we've got this one woman showing her knees. She's smoking. She's talking to a man who I'm not so sure what they might commence with. We've got makeup. Excellent. We're noticing her rouge. Good. Expression of self-confidence. And independence. She's choosing how to present herself to the world. Good. All right, let's move on to number 2 here in the middle. What did we notice? What's going on here? What does it tell us about women's changes for women? What is she holding in this middle one? Well, she's reaching for what I think is booze.
She's been offered liquor. She's more free to go to maybe a different class. You know, women in those days wouldn't be found or mingled with sailors.
Yeah, excellent. So in the first image, the question what she's holding, she's got a cigarette, and this is a diploma. This is her diploma. So she's just graduated from college. This is the commencement issue. In our second image, yes, we have this woman who looks like she's on a ship, who is reaching for alcohol, but is looking away, perhaps to defend her innocence, I'm wondering. Focus is not on the boyfriend going overseas. I like that, Mark, right? The lass who loved a sailor, he's leaving, she's already looking ahead, looking in another direction. Leanna's saying alcohol prohibition. Yeah, so that is a big feature of life in the 1920s. You know, there's the 19th Amendment, women get the right to vote, really big deal. Right before that is the 18th Amendment, which is prohibition. So not only is she engaging in vice, which is represented by alcohol, whether or not it's legal, here it's illegal. She's illegally engaging in procuring alcohol, or is engaging in procuring alcohol, which is in and of itself illegal. Good. Looking away from coverture. I like it, Peggy. Excellent. The chain looks like another man's head. Oh, interesting. He has tattoos, which makes him lower class. Right, excellent. So sort of those class lines are being blurred by women having independence. Great. Kathy thinks she's turning away from the alcohol. Interesting, could be. We can only interpret. We can only look at what we see in the observations. Good. Mark is... I
think he's still very worried about looking away, trying to refuse the alcohol, or looking out for what others might think of her. So she's still very protective of her image in society.
Yeah, she's thinking, who's going to see me? What are they going to think of me? Are the police coming? Maybe is my mom coming? we don't know what's happening off camera, so to speak. But she is in this sort of, for lack of a better word, dangerous situation. Okay, excellent. Let's look at number 3. What do we notice here on the right-hand side? Number 3, where does the term petting come from? Heavy petting. I don't know where the term comes from, Mitch. But it refers to the action that we see happening here. She is not sitting like a lady, Heather. You're right. And I'm going to guess that interpretation is based on the observation of seeing up her skirt, that we have this view that the artist has given us here. Number 3 is from 1947, after World War II. Excellent. So we are spanning time over the course of these 3 covers and seeing sort of how things progress. Yes, comparing.
She appears to be the woman in the photo number 3. She appears to be a working girl. Are we talking about
Working
prostitutes?
She could be. It's sort of hard to say with any certainty, but she's on the putting green. So we see the play on putting green. We see the putting green in the background here. Is that what it's called? Putting green? Why does that sound wrong? Anyway, golf. There's a golf course, but they are not using the golf course for golf. Oh, are we sure it's not two women? Interesting. I doubt it, Leanna, because this is Life magazine. But it's an interesting thought. So what do these images tell us about sort of the modern woman, the experience of the modern woman, from the perspective, at least, of Life magazine? Oh, thank you, Cheryl. It's from 1920. Ah, love it. Thanks. Heather says, the modern woman is trying new things. She's defying expectations. Good. Loss of morals, proper. So, right, these illustrations are sort of raising these questions, right, about the morality and sort of the overall good or not of this liberated modern woman. But we see women engaging in activities that they wouldn't have, that their mothers wouldn't have, at least, shall we say, right? So they are smoking and drinking in public. They are dating and petting, which is new. Dating is a new thing in the 1920s, and this idea of a romantic companionate marriage was a relatively new concept. This thought that partners in a marriage should be partners and attracted to each other. So young women wanted to be out in the world. They wanted to date. They wanted to drink. They wanted to have sex. There's also birth control is a thing that's starting to happen. Victorian corsets are gone, says Mitch. Yeah, they want to be out. They want to be part of society, engage in an active social life. Good. And yet, there is a level of humor across these three images. So as I said, and as we see, these are covers of Life magazine, which was a hugely popular magazine. It had a circulation of about 250,000 across the country. And in a certain way, this is sort of the male gaze. This is a male idea, poking fun at young women who are pushing the boundaries, who are exercising their independence and their empowerment. Yeah, seems rather disrespectful towards women. No babies or home chores in sight, right? So it's to my mind, one way I interpret this is it's using humor to sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Take the ammunition, take the fear out of the idea of the independent woman and the challenges that poses to traditional lifestyles. Beginning of the Cold War, yes, excellent. All right, so this is sort of the stereotypical, quintessential view of the flapper woman, right? That she's young, she's white, she's thin, she's got short hair, she's middle or upper class, she's out on the town, she's partying, and yet there's this layer of humor, but these are still useful sources, I think, because we can sort of read them against the grain, right? We know it's fictionalized, we know it's from a male perspective, but what can we sort of glean from them about the experiences of women by using them as primary sources? And one thing that we can think about is the fact that these were on the cover of Life magazine, a major nationally circulating magazine, poking fun at women implies some amount of resistance that women faced in pursuing this new lifestyle. And also we might notice that all of these women, and actually people that we see here, are white. But, whoops, it wasn't only white women who participated in flapper culture. What are some things that we see here? What other aspects of flapper culture do we notice in looking at these images, or that are reinforced from what we just looked at in the Life magazine covers? What do we see? Short hair, lots of leg. You're right, Heather. We have some Black women. They're wearing stockings, hanging with men. Good. Young people hanging out together. Exactly. So these young women are out, they're in public. Again, they're unchaperoned. We don't see any adults who are sort of watching over things. I mean, this group in the bottom left they're at a sporting event at an HBCU. But we see here that women of all backgrounds aspired to and participated in this idea of modern womanhood and the flapper culture. And it was made possible by other changes that were happening in the United States and in the world at this time, including the rise of mass markets and ready-made fashion made it affordable to be able to go out and buy these new clothes, and the rise of makeup being available at drugstores. And interestingly, too, at the same time, other makeup and other beauty products being produced by and marketed to specific groups of women. So for example, Madam C.J. Walker and her hair care products specifically for Black women. So the rise of the beauty industry and women taking control of their self-expression through their clothing, through their hair, through their makeup. One thing that I learned in working on this unit with my colleagues is that historians consider this the most drastic shift in women's appearance in American history. So we see these young women, and if you can picture, as Mitch, I think, alluded to in the chat, picture the Victorian woman, right? With her long skirts of many layers and her shirtwaist and her corset and her elaborate updo. It looks nothing like this. These women have cut off their hair, cut their skirts short, because they're out in the world. They need to be able to get in and out of cars. They don't want to spend time messing with their hair, etc. And so it's a visual representation of their rebellion, I guess, against traditional womanhood and their embracing of the empowerment that they feel because of all of these changes, like birth control, like the vote, like mass media, etc. But the 1920s didn't last forever. Women increased fashion icons and create huge industry and so women are economically empowered by this as well, and just one step from wearing trousers. Good. World War II allows non-white Americans to feel they too can be part of the American dream. Yes, and this question in the African American community about Blackness, how dark one's skin is and how that relates to perceptions of beauty is absolutely at play in this time. Let's remember, it's still Jim Crow America, very much so in the 1920s. And it's also the Great Migration is happening in the 1920s. So major shifts in Black life and Black culture going on at the same time. So yeah, here we see African American women in the bottom left-hand corner at I think it's at a football game at an HBCU. In the top left are Indigenous women in Alaska, and on the right are Mexican American women in Los Angeles, the land of Anne, obviously. Okay. In the interest of time, we're going to fast forward to the Great Depression. So the Depression changes things. We go from parties, flapper life, consumerism, to quite a different experience. So we know that when folks teach about the Great Depression, we talk about, the Dust Bowl, talk about sharecropping, we talk about the New Deal, and these are from the Farms Security Administration. And so here's another example of when you teach the FSA and you use these photographs, include photographs of women, and talk about the fact that Dorothea Lange was a woman who went and took a lot of these photographs that give us our sort of popular image of what the Great Depression was. That's thanks in large part to women. But we have this experience. But one of the things that we think is really interesting and exciting to do with WAMs, in the case, sort of across the board, but in the case of the Depression, is to think beyond sort of this stereotypical view of what happens in the Depression, which this is true, this is reality for a lot of people, but there were other things going on. It wasn't only, migrant mother and her helpless gaze, which was, you know, real. Women faced real hardships, but there were other things going on in the 1930s beyond economic hardship. And so we hope that with WAMS, we can sort of infuse activism into this time period that feels, you know, in the traditional US history textbook, a little bit like a march through economic and political history, which is important. But as I said, there are other things going on, and that's where we really see a lot of women's stories that are important and interesting that we can bring out. So with that in mind, we're going to watch another of our short videos based on a life story. This time it will be Emma Tenayuka. So as we watch this video, I want us to consider these 3 questions. How was her life shaped by the Depression? How did her actions shape her community? And what is one thing you learned that stood out to you about Emma Tenayuka? So how was her life shaped by the Depression? How did her actions shape her community? And what stands out to you in her story? Okay, let's go ahead and share. Here we go.
San Antonio, Texas, in the 1930s, was a bustling city with a vibrant Spanish-speaking community. But as the Great Depression swept the nation, the city's underlying economic and racial inequalities became more pronounced. Workers across many industries struggled to earn living wages under poor working conditions. Then, one determined young woman stepped in and helped to set things right. Emma Tenayuka was a Latina labor activist who understood how to stand up to injustice. When she was a young girl, she listened to public speakers addressing her community. As a high school junior, she participated in her first strike. Her empathy for the plight of the workers led her to join the Communist Party and the Workers' Alliance of America. Through her work, Emma developed a reputation for effective organizing. In 1938, she and her colleagues set out to help the pecan shelling union. 40% of the nation's pecans were shelled in Texas, and most of the shellers were women. Pecan shelling factories were poorly ventilated, which led to severe respiratory illnesses in workers. Under Emma's guidance, 12,000 pecan shellers went on strike, demanding higher wages and better working conditions. Emma led demonstrations and spoke at rallies. She was so successful in drawing attention that she eventually stepped out of the spotlight and worked behind the scenes. She wanted to focus on the workers, not on her. She made the right choice. The pecan shellers earned a wage increase, but Emma's success made her a target. In 1939, a violent anti-communist mob attempted to attack her while she led a party meeting. She only survived by escaping through a secret passageway in the building. In the 1940s, Emma even found herself under FBI surveillance. National distrust of communists was so great that federal agents spied on her and blocked her from government service during World War II. But Emma was a brave and passionate woman who refused to be silenced. She continued to protest, mentor, educate, and fight for workers' rights until her death in 1999. Emma Tenayuka showed the world that a young woman of color could make a real difference through activism and persistence.
Okay. So let's return to our questions. There we go. All right, so what do we think? Let's talk about that first question in the chat. How was Emma Tenayuka's life shaped by the Depression? What did we see? What did we hear? What do we think?
The hard life during the Great Depression led many to, in that period, to embrace the Karl Marx, the idealism of Karl Marx and communism. Mm-hmm. So that's one.
Yep, excellent. So she looked around and said, the workers, and specifically we learn about in the video, the pecan shellers are facing really, really tough conditions. So she organized, she protests, and ultimately she joins the Communist Party because she feels that that is who might have the interests of the workers most centered. Peggy says she saw suffering. She wanted to make it better for the workers. Excellent. Yeah, and that sort of gets us to question two. What impact did her actions have? Do we remember? We cover a lot of ground in her video. She saw suffering. She wanted to make it better for the workers. She supported the rise of labor unions. Yeah, and they're successful, right? She helps secure a wage increase for the pecan shellers. So even in the depths, in 1938, the depths of the Great Depression, here's an example of a woman taking on the plight of some of the most oppressed people in the United States. So unskilled, low-wage, working women of color. And she takes up the cause, takes up the mantle, leads a 12,000-person march to get a wage increase, again, in the midst of the Great Depression, that people in this period of great, great hardship find ways to organize, to speak out, to grow community, and draw attention to larger issues, as Devin says. Excellent. All right, so I'm keeping an eye on the time. So what we were going to do, which we won't do so that you have time in your breakout rooms, is take a look at two other life stories, which I did send around in advance, so many of you may have already read them, to think about this question from the perspective of two other women, or these questions, I should say. So Mary McLeod Bethune and Mary Kwena Pukui, who I know a number of you are familiar with. So just thinking about how their lives were shaped by the Depression, and to what degree, how their actions shaped their community, and what stands out to us about them. And so in lieu of reading and discussing each of these, just have these really quick summary slides that condense a woman's life into, 6 bullets. That's easy to do. But so I do encourage you to go read their life stories if you didn't already. We don't have videos for the two of them, at least not at this moment, but their life stories are definitely worth reading. I'm sure many of you are familiar with both of them already, but Mary McLeod Bethune, she's born in the Jim Crow South. She persists and gets an education for herself and then becomes a teacher. She looks around through her own experience, she knows, and then she looks around and sees that there basically are very, 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 very few educational opportunities for Black girls in the South, so she establishes a school, again, to lift up her entire community. She is an active anti-lynching and desegregation organizer. She serves as the president of a number of organizations, and she also establishes the National Council for Negro Women. During the Depression, she becomes a part of FDR's administration, heading up the Division of Negro Affairs for the National Youth Administration, and becomes a member of what's known as FDR's Black Cabinet. So again, working sort of like Elizabeth Freeman, working through official federal government channels to affect positive change for her entire community. And then she continues that work during World War II and beyond. And then, of course, I'm sure many of you know more than I do, much more than I do, about Mary Pukui, but she is born in 1895, a descendant of both Hawaiian high chiefs and New England colonial leaders, including a poet, Anne Bradstreet, who we have a life story of in WAMS. She's raised by her grandmother to learn Hawaiian language, culture, traditions, and history until her grandmother passes away when Mary is 9 years old. And then in the 30s, so in the midst of the Depression again, and then throughout her adulthood, she works to preserve, study, educate others on Hawaiian history and culture. She publishes a book of Hawaiian folktales, as well as other publications, and she wrote the Hawaiian English Dictionary and Grammar book. So she's a really key figure in the preservation of the Hawaiian language, of Hawaiian folkways, of Hawaiian traditions, culture, etc. And so what we see through the lives of these two women, as well as Emma Tenayuka, is that they're doing sort of a double duty. They're doing, in a way, a double shift of overcoming economic hardships in many cases, but then also lifting up their entire communities, working on issues of racial justice, community preservation, cultural preservation on top of sort of the base level hardships that everybody is facing during the Great Depression. Okay, so really quickly, just to give you a little taste of what you'll find in the World War II section of Confidence in Crises. Of course, there are propaganda posters, can't not do propaganda posters, but in the background information about these, we talk about the fact that they are very, very whitewashed depictions of the ideal American woman, and that even as women are stepping into factories, definitively masculine spaces, they are depicted still as beautiful and well put together with their lipstick and their makeup and their hair done very nicely. And then we talk about the fact that the military is still segregated during World War II, but women do join up, and there are factions, for lack of a better word, for Black women to participate in the war effort in the military, and that, you know, the military and the government use strategies to specifically attract women to participate in the war. And here we see one of them is by having famous designers create their uniforms. So playing to this idea of woman's identity tied to fashion and hoping that that will entice more women to participate. And then the Homemaker's Guide, so the women who don't join the military stay home and are expected to work in the factory, maintain the home, manage the rations, participate in civilian defense. So talk about the double shift, it's like the quadruple shift. So with that, let's go into our breakout rooms. I will put the discussion questions into the chat so you can find the Google Doc. And again, it'll be those two essential questions that we started off with, as well as some questions about classroom application.